Yeah. It rained in some places, but I don't think we got any now.
Oh, I think I did. Rained in my house.
It was because I have a little bit of fruit on my back window and it was still there when I got up.
It didn't rain far.
No, I don't know right now. It hit up here because I could see there was still water on the margins and stuff.
Right.
We had lightning.
Oh, yeah, I saw some of that. Which one do I talk into? Okay. Good morning. Is this working? I don't think so. I'm very loud normally. Do I have to push a button? Shall I try again? Now is it working? Okay. Good morning. Welcome. I'm Mary Chambliss. And it's really nice to see so many people out on a Friday morning when it's not going to be 100 degrees. They promise us, right? Only like 99.9. So anyway, but we're really glad you came. I really think you're going to find this is a very interesting session. Stephanie Mercier, who some of you probably know from her career on the Hill, because we all came to her when she was here, I can tell you. Anyway, her paper is wonderful. There are copies out there. Feel free to take for you and for anyone that you want to pass on to, because we have lots of copies, right? Okay, good. Because it has a wealth of information in it. All of you look younger than me, so you won't remember the number of farm bills that I do, and some of the background information that Stephanie has included in her paper, which will really be useful, I think, for many people as you undertake this venture of a farm bill, which is an endeavor, a venture. Venture is the right word, right? Adventure, I guess. We'll see what happens. Okay. Anyway, it's an excellent paper. It's got a lot of good discussion, background. It will make you stop and think about some of the things that we hope will be addressed and improved in a farm bill or perhaps in other legislation. You don't have to do everything in a farm bill because sometimes farm bills become very political, and the timing, particularly with the budget process, could be interesting. I have no idea, but I have a feeling it's going to be like, it's what I call the first baby syndrome. It'll get here when it gets here, okay? And you never quite know when that's going to be. In addition to Stephanie, we have 4 panelists who are all very good and very knowledgeable. I'm not going to, because you have on the blue sheet, you have their bios, which will give you a little more information. So I'm not going to go into that because I think it takes too much time. We have John Brooks and Susan Bradley from the AID office. We have Kim Elliott from the Center for Global Development. And we have Florence Rolle, that's fine, okay, from the local FAO office. So we have a good different perspectives on the issue of what we do about the food aid policy and how we can improve what I call food aid as well as food security policy. So what we'll do is we will have Stephanie present the paper first. Then I will ask each of our panelists to aim for about 10 minutes, and if you go too long, I will poke you or do something to tell you. I'm in hopes that we can get through by, I don't know, 10:15, 10:20 or so, and that will leave time for some Q&As for Stephanie, for anyone else, or for any dialogue among the people in the audience, because I see a number of people who are quite knowledgeable about this subject and also bring some different perspectives. So in addition to questions for the panel, there might also be some comments that people in the audience might like to make. Okay? With that, I think I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
Good morning, and thanks for getting here and being here at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. I know, having worked on the Hill, that that's a difficult time for a lot of people, but I appreciate it. Has been a while. I left the Senate Ag Committee in March, and I've been working on this paper and some other things since then, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to present it to you this morning. What I was commissioned to do by the partnership was essentially a couple of things. First of all, we started to review what was done in the '08 Farm Bill and has been done since then that I think leads to some improvements and reforms in the food aid programs. Second part of the paper deals with what's going on with global food security and particularly the Feed the Future initiative. And then there's some discussion of how do we better link and coordinate activities between food aid programs and the ag development programs that are now emerging. And then the last part of the paper is sort of some policy options that might be taken up, might be worth considering for the next Farm Bill. And I will tell you, having been through a couple of Farm Bills when I worked in the Senate, that you become careful after a while to not put a specific date on a Farm Bill. Because I remember how much time I spent talking about 2001 Farm Bill that turned out to be the 2002 Farm Bill, and similarly with the 2007 Farm Bill that turned out to be the 2008 Farm Bill. So mostly what I say now is just the next Farm Bill, and that leaves me some wiggle room in terms of when they actually get it done. Technically, the current Farm Bill expires on September 30th, 2012, but we know that these things don't necessarily get done by the appointed date. So my preference, even though my title says the 2012 Farm Bill, is to be a little more vague in that department. Okay. First thing I want to talk about is what we did in the '08 Farm Bill. And there were a lot of things going on ahead of that Farm Bill that really sort of set the stage for what we did. A lot of people wanted to look at ways to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the programs. And we took as a fair amount of guidance from recommendations that were provided in a report from the Government Accountability Office by the Senate Ag Committee. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. There was some pressure from various quarters to provide some more flexibility in the ability to program assistance, what's been called expanding the toolkit. And a big part of that was the Bush administration's effort to get some of the Title II funds to use for local and regional procurement. And then finally, a very important driver of that process, and we'll discuss later even more so now, is the budget environment. Oops, back, I'm going the wrong direction. In recent years, the GAO has done a lot of work on food aid. They've done a lot of traveling, they've done a lot of evaluations. At the request of the then chair and ranking members of the Senate Ag Committee, GAO took that existing work, did some new analysis, and combined them into recommendations as to what particular steps could be taken both by Congress and by the various agencies to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of those programs. This report was released in April 2007, just as the process was getting going in the Senate and the House, and so it was very timely in terms of that. A lot of the things that they were recommending were things that agencies could do themselves without any change in legislative authority, but some of them would require changes in statute. I'm going the wrong way again. Try this right. Okay. Where am I? All right, that's this one. All right, expanding the toolkit. There's been a lot of talk over the last several years about using cash to do local and regional procurement is a much more efficient way of doing food aid. And the Bush administration took these recommendations to heart, and beginning in 2005, began to press Congress to allow them to use some portion of Title II funds for that purpose. The initial proposal was actually to not just use Title II, but actually transfer some portion of it to another subcommittee in Congress. And that was probably a bad idea because Congress doesn't like to see changes in jurisdiction unilaterally imposed on it by the administration. So in addition to the fact that Congress didn't much like the idea of the LRP out of Title II, the fact that on top of it the administration also wanted to shift funds between subcommittees was definitely what one would call dead on arrival. So I remember talking to someone that told me, well, yeah, there was actually one senator who had an interest in this, but when that senator was asked to actually introduce it on the floor as an amendment, he declined. He didn't want to be known as being supportive of it, in other words. So it didn't get a whole lot of traction in Congress. Administration kept pushing this idea, similar proposal in the '07 budget proposal, although they backed away from the notion that they should shift the funds to another appropriations subcommittee. And then, of course, it was also in the Secretary Johan's Farm Bill proposal, which was released in January 2007. I will note that this one item was the only issue related to food aid in that entire proposal that was 163 pages long. So obviously the administration did not have a whole lot of ideas on what to do on food aid, except this one. The specific proposal itself did not gain a lot of traction in Congress, although I think it's fair to say the concept did somewhat better. And we'll talk about that as we go through. Going again. Okay. Budget environment. I think I went too far. By 2007, Congress was beginning to experience the adverse effects of its recent largesse. We went into the 01 Farm Bill with a budget surplus. And at that time, the budget resolution gave the Ag committees an additional $73.5 billion to write a farm bill. By the time we got to the 07-08 Farm Bill, it was clear that wasn't going to be quite so easy process. And folks who were interested in food aid became very clear early on that to the extent that there would be new resources available for the 08 Farm Bill, they probably weren't going to be aimed at food aid programs. And so the decision was made to focus more on substantive reform of the programs that wouldn't require new funds. And this is sort of a contrast of where we were in for the 02 Farm Bill as compared to where we were for the 08. This was the Congressional Budget Office projections of what the federal budget would look like beginning in 01 through 2011. Showed a surplus all the way out. Very, very nice, optimistic picture. This is what it looked like. When we did the 07 Farm Bill, this is the March 2007, and there's a reason why there's two sets of bars. The blue one represent what CBO was required by law to project, which among other things required them to assume that the 01 and 03 tax cuts would expire. That's why you have the blue lines above the zero mark, which I refer to as the status quo budget projections. The yellow lines were a separate analysis that CBO did, which assumed that in fact the tax cuts would not expire or would not be allowed to expire, and they showed a significant deficit, which, as we know, has been realized. So the contrast is that even though Congress gave the committees more than $70 billion for the 02 Farm Bill to do write new programs, add funds, et cetera, food aid only got about $400 million of that, which is less than 0.5%. So we thought it was very realistic to not assume that we'd get any new funds for the 08 Farm Bill, and at the end of the day, we did get some pretty modest money, but it was not something that anybody was counting on. Okay, so one of the places where we did actually get new funding, and I will tell you this was very literally happened at the last minute, is that we did get funding, $60 million to do a pilot program for local and regional procurement. This was provided to the Department of Agriculture because it was pretty clear that the members of the committee were not going to give mandatory money to an agency outside of USDA, even though obviously USAID is a lot more experienced doing food aid. That was just sort of the political reality that it would be USDA. We also provided authority for USAID to improve the logistics for food aid delivery, important piece. We provided more resources for them to do pre-positioning. At the time of the 08 Farm Bill, they had only resources to have 2 pre-post sites, one in the U.S., one overseas. As of late last year, they have 6, one in the U.S. and 5 overseas. And I personally think that this may be the single most important thing we did in the last Farm Bill in food aid, and it was probably one of the easiest things we did. We essentially went to USAID and said, okay, we know that $2 million isn't enough. What do you need? And they said, 10 would be good. And we put 10 on the Farm Bill, and that was it. But probably the easiest thing we did in the entire trade title was that one provision. But what it means is that now USAID thinks that rather than the 4 to 6 months, which GAO said on the report it took from the time that you order a commodity until it's actually delivered to the recipients, they think because of what they're going to have in prepo, they can shorten that to 2 or 3 weeks. That's a huge difference. And it was just a matter of changing one number in the Farm Bill. So sometimes it's the work that we do. Small things can have very big implications. We also allowed USAID to have greater flexibility in providing non-food resources to PPOs for Title II to cover their overhead and startup costs. This is in a section called 202E of the Food for Peace Act. And we also modified authority for the use of resources in the Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust, which is the Emergency Food Reserve. And this is why it's important to have those prepo sites and have most of them in Africa. This is the FuseNet map that is current. It shows what the food security situation is globally for the current quarter, second quarter of 2011. Almost all the areas of the world that are considered to be at risk are in Africa. And so it's very helpful to have 4 of the 5 overseas prepo sites being in Africa. The other places where there are problems right now are Afghanistan, Haiti, and Guatemala. And of course, Haiti and Guatemala we can provide out of the prepo site in Texas. So amazing what one small piece of legislation can accomplish. We also provided resources for AID to do a better job of information technology, of knowledge sharing, monitoring and evaluation, and then we also provided more funds for FuseNet. We were very particular about the language we used there because we were afraid that if they could use Title II money for FuseNet, that they would simply drop the other sources of funds that they were using and just leave level funding. So the language that's in the Farm Bill says that you can have up to $8 million of Title II for FuseNet, but only if you have similar money from other, matching money essentially from other parts of USAID. We also provided direction for improving food aid quality, ensured availability of food aid to address development objectives, what we call the safe box, minimum funding levels. And then finally, we did provide a modest funding boost of mandatory money to the McGovern-Dole program. So between McGovern-Dole and the LRP pilot, we got $144 million new money for food aid. But I think that monetary achievement is much overshadowed by the substantive reforms that we made in the program. There have been other relevant legislative and administrative actions that have taken place over the last 3 years that I want to mention. First of all, LRP is being done outside of Title II now in quite significant ways, and John Brooks will talk about that later. But beginning with the fiscal 08 supplemental appropriations bill, Congress provided funds outside of Title II for LRP. That led to the launching of the Emergency Food Security Program last spring, with funds available for LRP, but also for use of cash or food vouchers in regions where there is food present, but some people have problems with purchasing power. In fiscal 2010, President Obama increased the amount he requested for Title II appropriations from what it had been for several years at $1.2 billion to $1.7 billion, and he also doubled the money available for the McGovern-Dole program. In addition, USAID has done a lot of work in improving its procurement process and also the quality of the planning process, what we call the Bellman analysis process. This sort of set the stage for why Feed the Future is so important. This is a historical chart of where U.S. wheat prices have been over the last 200 years. Some of the longest running data sets that we have available in agriculture. And this is annual data, so it doesn't actually reflect the short-term spikes that we saw in food prices in 2008. But I think at one point there were wheat being priced at more than $20 a bushel in the spring of 2008. This reflects $7 or $8 a bushel. It's an annual average, but the short-term price was even higher than that. The implications it was very difficult for people in the developing world to adjust to those prices. Between January 2007 and May of 2008, FAO estimates that the prices doubled across the board for a range of staple food commodities, including rice, wheat, vegetable oil, corn, a number of things. This price spike resulted in an additional 100 million people worldwide falling into food security by the end of 2008. There are still a lot of arguments over what caused that spike, and we could go into that later if people have an interest in it. But I think importantly, the crisis highlighted the poor record that we have had recently on ag development in the developing world, especially in Africa, which led to stagnant productivity growth. The U.S. response to this is an initiative that's now called Feed the Future. Developed countries' expenditures, and this is not just the U.S., but also Europe and Japan, Australia, et cetera, had fallen off quite a bit over the last 20 or 30 years. In aggregate, they were spending something like $8 billion a year in the 1980s, and that fell to less than $3 billion a year in recent years, and that's even without adjusting for inflation. The result was that developing countries were far less able to feed their own people. 2 years ago, in Aquila, at the G8 meetings, leaders, including President Obama, pledged a $22 billion increase in ag development funding over the next 3 years, and the U.S. share of that was to be $3.5 billion. U.S. launched this new whole-of-government effort that was called Feed the Future in 2009, but it only got the name of Feed the Future in December 2010. And this is the hill that we have to climb in terms of ag productivity. This is for corn, and it's a comparison of the yield, average yields in the U.S., globally, and in sub-Saharan Africa. And since 1961, U.S. corn yield has increased more than 150%, while over that same period, the sub-Saharan Africa average corn yield has increased only 56%. At the same time, population in sub-Saharan Africa has tripled. So obviously, their ability to produce enough food to feed themselves has very much fallen behind. There are some key principles of Feed the Future that are being followed in doing this, setting up this process. These are enunciated by Secretary Clinton in a speech in September 2009. The first is to allow each country to define its agricultural investment needs, a so-called country-led approach. Second is to address the underlying causes of hunger and put women at the heart of efforts to find solutions. Third is improve coordination at the country, regional, and global levels to avoid duplication of effort. Fourth, use multilateral development organizations such as the World Bank. And then 5, stay the course. I think it's important to note how much the African continent themselves have recognized their problem and are stepping up with our own resources in this process. Leaders in Africa have really got a head start on the rest of the world in taking steps to address this ag productivity gap. They established the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, or CAADP, in 2003 and committed their member states to investing in their own agricultural sectors. They committed to invest at least 10% of their own national budgets in agriculture with the goal of achieving 6% agricultural growth. Through 2011, through last month, May 2011, 25 countries have adopted their own CAADP plans. So far, we've made some good progress, but it's very early in the Feed the Future process. According to data provided by USAID from my paper, spending on ag development by that agency has more than tripled over the last 3 years. 22 focus countries for Feed the Future were identified last spring. 12 of those are in Africa. That process has been divided into phase 2 activities, phase 1 activities, which are focusing on capacity building, and then secondarily phase 2 activities, which are to address productivity, infrastructure, value chain development, and nutritional needs. The aim of Feed the Future overall is to mesh that U.S. effort with the efforts of the focus countries themselves in developing and carrying out development plans. There are clearly gains to be made from synergies that are available from better coordination between different kinds of assistance, such as food aid and development. Obviously, there's a very significant overlap between the world's poor and the world's hungry. There's roughly 1 billion in each category, and I think it's fair to say most of those people fall under both. We need to improve our ability to address both of those issues. And maybe I'm wrong, but it's the best I can tell, aside from the McGovern-Dole program, there is no program has an explicit policy objective of eventually weaning countries off of U.S. assistance. So I think that's maybe something we should look at. There are clearly some obstacles out there to improving those linkages. One is the fact that there are limited resources, even though such constraints ought to, by any sensible rule, encourage efforts to improve efficiency. In fact, a lot of program managers become reluctant to share control under those situations. Management and oversight structure of the programs is an obstacle because they run through different offices, have different legislative authorities, and different congressional authorizers. So that's an obstacle. And then a final one that I identified is the fact that right now we aren't doing these programs in the same countries to a large extent. Although we're getting better in that score. For example, of the 20 Feed the Future countries, 22 Feed the Future focus countries, only 9 of them had Title II non-emergency programming in fiscal 2009. We can see, we already know that there are gains from linking these kinds of activities, and you can see them in some cases just from linked activities under a single program umbrella. Last summer, I had the opportunity to visit several Title II non-emergency projects in Uganda that are run by Mercier and ACDI VOCA. People are doing things like growing vegetables for income, as well as for their own family's nutrition. They're also raising nursery trees and improving their hygienic practices. How much would these activities under Title II be enhanced if they had better access to water for irrigation through something like a Feed the Future Millennium Challenge Corporation project? There are a lot of potential partner programs out there, obviously Feed the Future, MCC, the USAID health programs such as PEPFAR. Peace Corps is doing some work now and I think could do more. And then there's, of course, USDA's food aid programs for Governor Dole and Food for Progress. There's also potential linkages with the World Bank's new Global and Agricultural Food Security Program and development programs run by other donor countries. And this is a fruit tree nursery that I visited in Uganda last summer. They are raising these trees which will be planted, and then over the years they'll have an income generator from the fruit from those trees. They are thinking very long term in these projects, which is a good change, I think. But you don't generally think of a nursery tree as a short-term income opportunity. Obviously, food aid and food security are going to face a lot of challenges over the next several years. Budget environment, which I talked about a little bit, both food aid and food security funding is under severe pressure for fiscal 2012. House Agri-Appropriations bill, which has been marked up in committee and faces a floor vote, I think, next week, would cut Title II funding by nearly $500 million compared to fiscal 11. Haven't yet seen what the Foreign Ops Subcommittee is going to propose on Feed the Future, but it'll probably be a cut. We also face the problem of commodity price volatility, which impacts both food aid needs and donors' ability to respond. Then there's a question about what happens with the Doha round. My best sense right now is that they've sort of thrown in the towel and trying to get a full multi-sectoral negotiation result in that they're trying to do, I guess they're calling it Doha round light, but nobody is quite sure what that means. One thing I do know is that the language that's in the current text, the agricultural text on food aid, is a problem for us. And if we're going to do a Doha round light, we need to make sure that it doesn't have food aid language that continues to be problematic. There are several areas for potential policy reform that I like to raise. One is I think there's a lot of scope for improved use of risk management tools in the commodity price area. Food reserves, we have the Emerson Trust, which right now is entirely cash and hasn't been used for only once in the last 3 years, so we need to find out if there's a more effective use of those resources. We need to, I think, look at the possibility of hedging price risk in either futures or option markets. And then there's this new phenomenon of weather risk insurance or weather derivatives that I think has real possibilities. Monetization is still going to be an issue. We do have some improvements there because of the increased availability of cash on the 202E, but I think we need to take a second look at this proposal for Community Development Fund that it would provide yet more cash. I would not ever suggest we should get rid of monetization. I think it's an important part of what we do, but I think we probably need to be a little more judicious with it. I think we need to take a second look at cargo preference. This is not an Ag Committee issue. It's actually Commerce Committee, which will make it more difficult. But even something as basic as allowing a waiver of cargo preference if there's a huge gap between U.S. flagged ships and non-U.S. flagged ships would provide some flexibility for the programs. Although I think, frankly, that with the new focus on the prepo sites, that cargo preference may, in fact, be less of an obstacle than it has been in the past. And then finally, I think we need to look at how do we improve public awareness of the importance of food aid and food security funding. And I think we need to look at some of these social media outlets. Despite Congressman Wiener's problems with Twitter, I would say we shouldn't abandon that possibility. I mean, the one campaign has a presence on Twitter, and they have 500,000 people following them. So that's, I think, a precedent we should take a look at. Finally, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. government has taken a lot of important steps in the last several years in improving both the efficiency of food aid programs and re-engaging in a much larger way on the global agricultural development front with Feed the Future. The next logical step is to look for ways to enhance linkages between those programs, which should improve cost effectiveness and lead to better outcome in development. The obstacles are daunting, but I think we need to remember why we're doing this work. It's to help people. And this is a photo of some children at a school in Nairobi, Kenya that I visited last summer, and still was very struck by how poor they were, but how hopeful they were. And I think we can do more to help them. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. As I said, the paper has a wealth of information, and you can see how thought-provoking some of the issues that Stephanie raised are. I also want to note there were a lot of people in the last Farm Bill who did a lot of very, very good work, but at the top of the list was Stephanie Mercier, okay? Sure, I'll give you back your pen. A lot of the very positive things that we saw, I don't think would have been there if it had not been for Stephanie and some of her colleagues in the Hill. I think, too, we have to really stop and think as we go through this process what the budget realities that I'm assuming Congress will deal with. If they don't, then I don't know what we do. But anyway, if they don't, but assuming that they will deal with it, then I think it really puts a lot more importance in how we think of the technical changes to improve the efficiency and the operations. If there are people in this room and on this table who have actually, tried to operate food aid programs with various legislative requirements, and it is not easy, let me tell you. It is not easy. If there was some way to look at some of those, I think that would also facilitate improvements in food aid and food security, and certainly make the life of those people who have to manage this day-to-day easier. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Brooks, okay? Where's my technical expert? Do I turn this off? Okay, thank you. I knew the technical expert would be here somewhere.
Good morning, everyone. At the risk of being poked by Mary Chambliss for going over her 10-minute limit, just pull my jacket. I might prefer the poking. I will be very brief. I've been with Food for Peace now since 2001, and I've served in a number of capacities between our operations department as well as our policy office, and that has been both here in our headquarters here in Washington, just up the street, but also at our U.S. mission to the UN agencies in Rome, working with the World Food Program, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and occasionally EFOD. Since then, in this 10-year period, there have been, I think, a number of innovative approaches that have been taken towards improving certain aspects of the Title II program, and Stephanie both mentioned and highlights them well in her paper. The expansion of prepo sites, for example, I think is probably chief among them, and I fully support that. But we haven't had a totally new tool, and when I say we, I mean the Office of Food for Peace. We haven't had a totally new tool that we could use in responding to food insecurity alongside Title II until now. And that new tool is called the Emergency Food Security Program. So what is it? What does it do? How has it been employed? How much have we been able to invest in those resources? And what success stories are we able to point to in its very short lifespan? The program itself got underway as of April of last year. We're just into the second fiscal year. It uses funds authorized under the Foreign Assistance Act through a program called, uses International Disaster Assistance Funds authorized under the Foreign Assistance Act to allow the Office of Food for Peace to provide cash assistance in response to food insecurity. What we have attempted to do in the year and a half, now going in, again, working our way towards 2 years, that the program has been in existence, is to try to employ those cash resources in a way that complements our Title II in-kind food assistance. And I think we have been very successful in doing that today. So when do we employ these cash resources? Well, we look at three primary factors. Once an applicant has made the case successfully that an emergency situation exists that requires food assistance. One, it's a question of whether or not cash can be used as a more timely response to food insecurity instead of the traditional Title II in-kind assistance that we can provide. The addition of the expansion of our prepositioning sites around the globe certainly makes that argument a little more difficult for our would-be implementing partners to make, because now we no longer necessarily have to wait 4 to 6 months for commodities to be procured here in the U.S. and shipped overseas. Now, because we've been able to stand up these prepositioning sites around the globe, we can, in certain cases, respond within weeks as opposed to months. And so that, as an argument to use cash assistance as opposed to Title II, I think is going to be a little more difficult to make as we evolve. The second instance in which we would consider using cash is in those instances where market conditions indicate that cash is a better response as opposed to providing in-kind commodities from the U.S. and, quite frankly, from anywhere else that we would purchase them. And so in those instances, it's not a question of whether food is available. It's a question of whether or not the targeted beneficiaries actually have economic access to it. And so we provide cash in those instances through our implementing partners, and then they provide food vouchers or cash transfers directly to beneficiaries, and then then the beneficiaries actually then go into the market and buy their own food. And then the final issue that we consider is whether or not, in using cash, we can reach significantly more beneficiaries as opposed to shipping the food from the U.S. Quite frankly, that hasn't been an argument that has been used very much in the year and a half that the program has been up. I mean, most of the proposals that we have awarded IDA funds to under the Emergency Food Security Program have come about as a result of a timeliness argument or an argument that indicates that market conditions are such that it makes sense to use cash as opposed to Title II assistance. In last fiscal year, we actually took in about $288 million in IDA assistance that we used under the EFSP program. What is amazing about this is that we were able to invest $244 million of that in a 6-month period, because, as I said, the program didn't stand up until April of last year. And so the 6 months between April and September, we made upwards of 17 awards globally to UN agencies like the World Food Program, to our traditional NGO, PBO partners like Catholic Relief Services and Mercier and the like. This fiscal year, we had $300 million of new fresh money, fresh from fiscal year 2011. We had a very small carryover from fiscal year 2010, and that carryover, quite frankly, only existed because we weren't able to spend it in that 6-month period. We certainly think we'll be able to spend it over the course of this fiscal year. So when you add the small carryover to the $300 million that we have received for fiscal year 2011, we're looking at approximately $340 to $343 million that we have to invest this fiscal year. And as of this very moment, we have made awards totaling over $100 million, and we have proposals in the pipeline now that will carry us over $200 million. And so if you look at the calendar, we think that we are in a pretty good position to make certain that we're making the wise investment of the balance of these resources between now and the end of the fiscal year. One thing that Mary said that I thought was extremely helpful, and it went a long way towards answering a question that I had when I first got the invitations to be a part of this panel. And the question was, why am I on this panel when my program is authorized not from the Farm Bill but under the Foreign Assistance Act? And Mary said, everything doesn't have to be done through the Farm Bill, and she's exactly right. We have a number of successful instances in which we have used EFSP in a way that complements Title II assistance. That in Pakistan, for example, in response to the floods, we had Title II commodities already in country that we diverted. We had Title II commodities coming from our prepositioning facilities, and then we provided about $117 million in cash assistance directly to the World Food Program for local and regional procurement, but also to 2 of our NGO partners who, in those instances where market conditions were such that we could use food vouchers, they provided food vouchers directly to beneficiaries. It is a classic example of what we intended to do with this program in a way that quite really does match well with Title II. We have a similar instance, quite frankly, in response to Haiti. Our initial response to Haiti with the earthquake was to provide Title II assistance. So we did the diversions. We took commodities from our preposition site. But then once this program stood up, we made a very quick investment of about $50 million that is being used for a cash for work program by the World Food Program and also a food voucher program by Mercier. And so just two very simple and quick examples of what would represent, quite frankly, I think an ideal from Food for Peace's point of view of how we can blend EFSP and Title II, understanding that one is coming from the Farm Bill and the other is coming from the Foreign Assistance Act. In terms of opportunities going forward, we recently issued, and this is as of April of this year, so just a couple of months ago, a revised solicitation guidance for that applicants use to put their proposals together. Up until that happened, applicants could only apply for EFSP assistance. They could not apply for Title II under the same solicitation. We consulted with a number of our implementing partners. We consulted with a number of subject matter experts on this topic and made the decision that what we would do is to allow those applicants to put in a single application that would ask for both Title II and EFSP simultaneously. It allows, I think, our implementing partners to think a bit more strategically. They can figure out ways that they can better integrate the limited funding assistance that they receive from our office. And thus far, I think it's worked very well. We also have, as a part of our revised annual program statement, or APS, which you can find on our web page, we also now have the option of telling applicants who have applied for one particular funding stream, Title II, for example, that from our assessment, whether it's coming from our mission offices or whether it's coming from FuseNet or wherever, that perhaps a better response to the emergency at hand is coming from, should be to use the FSP, to use cash assistance. We couldn't do that before because this is a competitive process, so there are limits to what we can say to any of our applicants. But a key, I think, revision to the solicitation guidance this time around is that we now have that option of being able to be a bit more directive at the submission of a concept paper, which is how the application process gets underway. And we also have the advantage of having run the program for a year. And so as we look through the reports that come back from WFP, from the CRSs, from ACTID, for example, we're able to try to understand and to work to close the gap between what they indicate they can do in their application and what they ultimately are able to do once the program is up and running, is underway. And so that's another factor that I think is going to influence greatly when an applicant, for example, says that they can make a local or regional procurement more quickly than we can provide commodities from our pre-positioned sites or from a direct order from the U.S. Because I have at least two examples where that was indicated in the application, but it didn't actually come to pass for a host of reasons. And so I think, again, we're going to be a bit more skeptical of such proposals as we go forward. And so in conclusion, just to say, yes, not all of our responses to food insecurity have to come through the Farm Bill. We're grateful for the cash assistance that we're able to bring to bear as a result of the Foreign Assistance Act and the International Disaster Assistance Funds that we have. And I look forward to kind of responding to any questions that you would have, kind of how this has worked beyond what I've already said.
Perfect time.
10?
Perfect.
Good.
Thank you very much, John. And if you have any questions about Rome, ask John. Okay, it's wonderful there in that job. Now we're going to turn to Susan Bradley, who's going to bring us up to date on all of the good activities and what the future looks like for Feed the Future.
Thank you very much, Mary. And thank you, Stephanie. I think we owe you a big round of applause for the paper. I think in your paper you talk about Congress beginning to grapple with the next Farm Bill. Actually, the administration is beginning to grapple with what it would like to see in there. And I think one thing that I'd like to stress is that I think the paper tells a really good story about what good legislation can do. If you think about the changes that have happened in Food for Peace and in Food for Progress, I mean, monitoring and evaluation has been strengthened incredibly. The whole idea of real-time learning has been strengthened, the pre-positioning, as you've mentioned. There's evaluation work that really holds some promise. Food for Peace right now is taking a very hard look at programs that have phased out to see what is sustainable, what is left behind, and if there isn't anything, why. So I think that this bodes well for the future, and it's the Farm Bill that provided the resources for a lot of this to happen. So I think the paper is fantastic in that regard. I want to touch upon just a couple of points, and most of them have to do with linkages. There was and continues to be quite a bit of hope that Feed the Future, which is the administration's efforts, not just to respond to what we saw earlier when the high food price crisis, if you remember that chart, the prices going up and up and up, and of course back in 2007 and 2008, it really was a sort of eye-opening incident. People, not just in the United States, of course, across the world, realized something was out of kilter. And one of those things, of course, as was mentioned, was that we had abandoned agriculture, abandoned investment in agriculture. But what I really want to mention with that slide is that I think about two things whenever I see it. I think we have to remind ourselves that when we use that number, 1 billion people going to bed hungry every night, at best, in any given year, it's 100 million, maybe 103 million, is that the record, that receive food assistance. The rest are still going to bed hungry at night. And so I always think of that when I think Feed the Future. One of the things that I think we all have to think about now is that when we see that chart, it's saying food is expensive. That's our food too. That's food in the United States. And so there's been this major shift from food being a relatively cheap fix. You know, there's a problem, throw food at it. Well, those days are gone. They are gone. Food is a valuable commodity, and that means that as we do begin to grapple with the next Farm Bill, we recognize that. We bring that right up front. Food is not a cheap resource anymore. That's all I'm going to go to linkages. I just wanted to say that it's becoming, Feed the Future is becoming more and more and more and more relevant, and that means we do have to get it right. We do have to have the linkages right. I'm going to start with the GASP, which is the multi-donor trust fund that Stephanie mentioned. And it's in one of the things that's easy to forget is that the GASP, well, one thing, was very, very strongly promoted by the United States. And oh, I'm sorry.
It's such a bad acronym.
The Global Agriculture and Food Security Program is what it is.
It's a bad acronym.
Yeah, it really is a terrible acronym, and I'm sorry for having used it.
It's not your fault. You didn't make it up.
If you look at the criteria and how that money is actually used, I think recently 2 days ago, a number of countries have been informed that they're going to be receiving funds. The process that is entailed to receive the funds includes this idea that was sort of generated through the CADAP, the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, of having a country plan, one coherent country investment plan that is supported by donors on the ground. So it is that plan then, in theory, that is supposed to provide the groundwork for linkages, for strategic partnerships between donors and, from the U.S. perspective, strategic integration of U.S. resources at a country level. So the GASP, the multi-donor trust fund money, isn't separate from our own investments. It is supposed to be being integrated under this common framework. That's one of the linkages. That's probably the farthest reach. A closer reach and closer to home in this room is what's going on with food assistance at a country level and Feed the Future. And I am not going to pretend at this point that we have perfect integration across the board. There are a lot of challenges, some of them that were mentioned in the bureaucratic, different offices, a lot of culture differences. But some of them are much more practical than that. the stumbling block that's put in front of you when you're simply on different program cycles is really significant. Food for Peace and USDA have been talking about how to bring their program cycles a little bit closer so that there'll be common guidance for both programs issued, and programs will be awarded at the same time, increasing the likelihood that we can even integrate our food assistance programs. Now, from Feed the Future's perspective, I would say there are probably, well, we mentioned there are 9 countries where there's an overlap with Title II and Feed the Future, non-emergency Title II. I don't know, Stephanie, if you have a better idea about Food for Progress. I don't. I think that there are probably 3 additional countries where Food for Progress is being implemented. And right now, what's going on is a dialogue at the country level. There's a Feed the Future team that's put together at the country level that is working to bring these programs closer together. In Mozambique, the Feed the Future program and the Food for Peace Title II program are completely integrated. Feed the Future is the phase out for the Title II program. And that, to me, is a fantastic model. It's not just integrating resources, but it really is thinking about this question of what is the future of food assistance in this particular country. Ethiopia, another very, very interesting model that's being, I would say it's being grappled with at this point, and it's one that is a challenge, I think, for all of us in the room. They call it a push-pull model, and what it's trying to do is link the productive safety net in Ethiopia. I don't know if you know this, it's a huge 8 million person safety net that is supported with both through cash and food assistance. For the past several years, food assistance has been the more valuable of those 2 resource inputs. But what has become apparent is that although it is stabilizing households, it is letting households rebuild coping mechanisms, it is not on its own the answer to poverty reduction. Families just cannot or are not climbing in the 5-year time frame out of poverty in any significant way, despite the hopes of and the words perhaps of aspirational. Yes, I'm not going to continue down that line. But what is happening there in Ethiopia is that the Feed the Future team has said, okay, we're focusing the bulk of our development resources in higher productive districts, but we're going to target those so that they are proximate to lesser productive safety net districts, so they are geographically proximate. And we're going to look for linkages, particularly value chain investments, that can geographically bridge these areas and begin to increase labor opportunities, job opportunities, increase productivity by sharing extension. They call it push-pull because they're thinking of the safety net as a push and economic investment as the pull. They'll be investing in increasing skills, in increasing access to credit, microfinance, trying to actually build the economic resilience of these households to the point where they can participate or their participation is accelerated in this economic growth process. One more linkage. Certainly what we're doing in nutrition is, I think, perhaps the most significant linkage and significant change in Feed the Future. And it is supported through our Title II programs, particularly the focus in under twos. It is supported through Global Health Initiative resources and through Title II resources. So I think we're seeing incredible integration there, incredible linkages. Do I have another point? And have you been keeping time for me?
I'm watching.
Okay.
You're okay.
Okay. Another linkage, and it's less, I'll make this one my last one, because it's less visible right now. But we talk about feed the future, feed the future. The other thing that's sort of becoming a mantra for us is USAID Forward, which is a kind of a procurement reform process going on. But it's not a business reform. Procurement reform doesn't capture what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be sort of a complete shift in the way we think about development. So we're trying to use our procurement processes to support development process in a country and ownership in a country. And so one piece of this right now is a sort of a jump starting of a capacity building program. It's reaching into private sector, it's reaching into civil society, it's reaching into government, and it's providing basic leadership skills, training 100, 200, they're up to 500 people in some of our Feed the Future countries, but building food security networks in these countries. So not just focused on private sector, not just focused on government, but basically creating a common vocabulary about food security, which is, it's inclusive of agriculture growth, it's inclusive of nutrition, it's resiliency, it's risk management, so that you have a cadre of champions at a country level that can keep this dialogue and use this dialogue. And we've seen incredible impacts already from just a very, very small investment. And people who have gone back to their countries and have said, wait a second, you know, you didn't consult so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. It's truly inspirational. And I'm calling it a linkage because it's pulling together the local organizations that our NGOs are working with, as well as the Ministry of Agriculture, as well as the East African Grains Council, and bringing them all into the same room and using the same vocabulary and dialogue with them. All right, I'm going to leave it there because I'm better at answering questions than I am at talking to people.
Since you did the talking very well, I'm sure the answers will be exceptionally good, okay? It's always amazing to me, all the dynamics and things that go on. All of you probably out here are a little closer, I know you're closer to it than I am now. But I had heard a little bit about the USAID Forward, but to learn a little bit more was interesting, okay? Now we're going to turn to a different subject and a different perspective. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And we're going to ask him to talk to us about the Doha and maybe trade's perspective in general. Does that make sense?
I'll do a little bit of that.
Okay, do a little bit of that.
I'll start by thanking Daniel and Mary for including me in this panel. It's really, I'm quite feel honored and privileged to be on a panel with such experienced and knowledgeable people, and I've already learned a lot, and a lot of really exciting new programs that make me really much more hopeful about this issue than I have been for a while, especially after the 2008 Farm Bill. So I'm really glad to be here, glad to see so many people are here interested in this issue, and again, that makes me more hopeful for the next Farm Bill and what we can do to keep pushing these reforms and improving U.S. food aid. I also want to join the other panelists in congratulating Stephanie, and it really is a great paper, and the title is completely misleading because it's much more than food aid in the next Farm Bill. I mean, it is the sort of whole evolution, and it's really just, it's a great resource. I think obviously to be relevant, Stephanie didn't sort of frontally take on the iron triangle supporting food aid, but notes the sort of incremental reforms, but important reforms in some areas that have been made, and she pointed to pre-positioning as one of the key ones. The pilot on the local and regional purchase, I was really excited to learn more about the new emergency food security program at AID, which I think is particularly important in sort of the current environment where you need food aid in some situations of emergency or natural disasters or conflict, refugees, but in an environment where with the weather-related effects of climate change probably giving us more and more price volatility, it seems to me cash has got to be a bigger part of the answer. And here there's a lot of talk about local and regional purchase, but I think the fact that they're also using some of the money for cash transfers and for vouchers is also a really important innovation and something we ought to think more about and focus a little bit more on, because with the price spikes, it's not necessarily an issue of food availability. It is about incomes being constrained by the price spike. So I think that's a really important innovation, and I really applaud AID for moving that, and for the foreign ops committees for giving them the latitude and the budget to do that. I think that's really great. So let's see on. Oh, just one other thing I want to mention before I turn to trade is another thing that Stephanie points to, again, around this food price volatility issue, is the need for more risk management tools. And she points to this paper by Brian Wright that was in the context of using options to sort of loosen up some of the corn that's going into biofuels to be used for food in the case when food prices are spiking. And I think that's a very useful idea. But I just want to also point to a paper by my colleague, Vij Ramachandran, which is on our website, which was in the context of the World Food Program, but I think might also be something that USDA could do, which again is using futures markets to buy food, or to do these options so that you're not buying food in an emergency on spot markets when prices are spiking. And so I think that idea of using the futures markets to the degree that we're still using in-kind food aid is something to look at, and so I would encourage you to go to the website and look at Vij's paper. One other thing I'll plug, since Gatsby came up on our website, I encourage you all to go. Connie Villette, my colleague who works on the foreign assistance reform, has a blog from a few days ago encouraging people to come up with new acronyms for this program. So please, and she sort of is trying to say, if we all can kind of come up with something and make it a consensus and we just start using it, maybe we can change this, and that would be a great contribution. So let me turn to trade and just say a couple of things here. I think it was Stephanie that sort of warned against having something in a Doha light package or whatever comes, if anything comes out of Doha, that would sort of tie the hands. But I think, we have, again, this is going to be a package. It's going to be a small package, but they're still going to everybody's going to have to give something. So I think the question is, what is the U.S. willing to pay to lock in the elimination of export subsidies on the part of the European Union? And that was the context in which the food aid, and so I think some further reforms on monetization or some of the other provisions, I think it would be worthwhile getting. I think for institutional and for the credibility of the international trade system, getting something out of Doha would be important. I think it's quite a sad commentary that that's all it's going to be. But so for institutional reasons, a package would be good. And I think the U.S. is going to have to give something. And so I think and it would be something if we can. I would share Stephanie's concern that it's sort of crammed down Congress's throat. That's not the best way to do it. But I think we need to be thinking about what can the U.S. contribute, because it would be worthwhile getting locking in the elimination of export subsidies, because we saw those return. We thought they were gone. We thought maybe we didn't have to worry about them, and then they came back. And let me just link that point about to sort of Stephanie's other really interesting discussion in the paper, and then also Susan on the linkages. And I think with Feed the Future, and I was really interested to hear that if I heard it right, that in the Feed the Future countries, then the Title II aid gets phased out.
I gave you one example.
Okay. Well, all right. So
but the intent is to develop a vision so that there's a definite understanding of where food assistance is going in that country.
Well, I think so one example that maybe becomes a model, because it does seem to me, it does seem to me that Feed the Future raises the question about whether there is a role for development assistance using food aid. Does that really make sense? And really rethinking, again, the whole idea of Feed the Future is to make this a strategy, to make it coherent. And so I think that would be sort of the really fundamental point that I drew out of Stephanie's paper, is to really rethink, and food aid in emergencies, but let's try and do food security as part of development. And so that's where I'll leave it, and I'll look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
That certainly brought some interesting questions to the surface. We'll see what happens with that. I like the way you took the one example and worked forward. Nice try, Kim. Nice try. I have absolute faith that AID will be able to have this very positive, constructive Mozambican model
work out in other countries too. My guess is it depends a lot upon the U.S. government people in a country plus the local government, and you must have just had the right dynamics, and we need to figure out ways to have that dynamic happen more often and more frequently. Okay, thanks. Now we're going to turn to Florence from our Food and Agricultural FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization. I always have to stop and think if I'm in Washington, I can't call it FAO. If you're in Rome, you call it FAO. It took me a while to learn that. So anyway, Florence, come tell us what FAO is up to, okay?
Good morning, everybody. I'm very glad to be here because you gave me the opportunity to speak about my field experience, and I always enjoy sharing these with people here in DC. I spent 3 years in Ethiopia. I came to DC a few months ago, 6 months ago, so I wanted to build on what Susan said and give you an example, a concrete example of a transition from emergency food aid to development in Ethiopia. So the first thing, Ethiopia, just a few keywords. 80 million inhabitants, a huge growth rate. So the World Bank projection is double, the country is going to double its population in 27 years. So 160 people in 27 years. First big challenge for Ethiopia. Second one, agriculture, the most important economic sector, like in many sub-Saharan countries, in terms of export earning, in terms of employment, in terms of GDP. So, and this agriculture is a subsistence agriculture, low input, low output, smallholders. I mean, 60% of the farmers have less than 1 hectares, and 40% have less than half an hectare. So with your population growth, you can imagine the challenges. Nutrition status poor, 47% of the children under age of 5 are chronically undernourished. So in Ethiopia, every year, you have between 7 and 8 people chronically food insecure, which means that they can't, I mean, they have a food gap within the 12 months. And in addition, if you have a shock, drought, the food price crisis in 2008, you have between 3 and 5 million people in need of food aid. So more than 10% of the population in need of food. So how the government, the Ethiopian government responded to that? In 2002, there was a huge drought, big famine, big images of Ethiopia, Ethiopian people dying, etc. The government said, we need to do something. We're going to avoid these images in the future. They launched a new coalition for food security in 2002, which materialized into a food security program supported by 9 donors. USAID being one of them. So these food security program, Susan mentioned it, it's called the Productive Safety Net program, 2.5 billion, or today I think it's 3 billion over 5 years, 7 people food insecure targeted, and it started food aid against public works. So people, households who are able to give labor were obliged to provide public works and receive the food in exchange. Then it evolved into a cash and food transfer. It had 3 objectives. The first one was to smooth food consumption. The second one was to avoid asset depletion, which happens when there is an emergency, because the time we respond, the people have already coped with it by selling their assets. And the third one was to build new assets thanks to the public works. That was the idea. After a few years, they realized that it worked, it achieved its first objective. People ate more food and of better quality. But on the depletion of assets, it was not so clear, And on the building of assets, nothing. So it went into this cash as well transfer, because the idea of the cash transfer was to provide to these people regular income so that they can also invest in other things than food. It worked a bit, but not very satisfactorily. Some households invested, but not in productive assets, but in health and education, which are more longer-term assets. But then there was an issue in 2008 with the food price increase. The correspondence between the food and the cash didn't follow the evolution, so it was much better then for the household to get the food instead of the cash because the purchasing power was less. So then it was a success, but not enough to pull all these people out of poverty. So we went into a second phase. All these donors and the government went into a second phase, 2009, 2014, which brought two new things. One was a risk financing mechanism that he mentioned, and it's because with all these shocks, you know, repeating shocks, I mean, there is a drought every 3-4 years in Ethiopia. People who were food secure before were entering, I mean, we're becoming food insecure, so we're had to enter into this food security program, which the government didn't want to extend, of course. So donors have put money, a pot of money, which is supposed to be used for food or cash transfer in case of a shock. Very nice on paper. When I left Ethiopia, they wouldn't agree with me if I say nothing was on the ground, but I mean, it's difficult to put in place, to have the trigger in place, to have the mechanism, the government be organized to respond, target. I mean, it's difficult. The second thing that they did is that they realized we're not going to graduate. What they call graduate is to pull these people out of their food insecurity if we don't invest in productive agriculture. So they added a component on this productive safety net program, which is called Household Asset Building Program, which is basically giving extension packages to the farmers on credit. Unfortunately, the credit rate, I mean, the rate of people taking credit is still low. The main issues are it's still risky, and because you never know whether you're going to benefit from this program. Are you going to be a beneficiary, or 1 year are you going to be out of the beneficiary? So if you invest, you take a credit on. But then mainly it's because in these areas, remote areas, very degraded areas, what is the future in agriculture? Okay, you could increase a bit your yield and become a bit more food insecurity. But where is the future? And the third point is, you've got credit, you've got your package, but the whole enabling environment. I mean, if you don't have, you know, the project will give you your seed and fertilizer, but if you don't have the seed and fertilizer policy in place, which will, in the long term, provide you, I mean, ensure you that you will get your seed on time, your fertilizer on time, it's not going to do much. So that's why the donors and the government pushed a lot for investing also in productive areas. And this is what Susan was referring to. I mean, we realized that 70% of the aid in Ethiopia was going into these food insecurity, social safety net, thematic areas. So if you have all these aid going there, how do you want agriculture production to increase, agricultural productivity and commercialization to happen? So there was a shift, not a shift to forget about all these food insecure people, but to put more money into agricultural development. And Feed the Future came right on time, because I think USAID, before Feed the Future, didn't invest at all in the agricultural development. The whole money was going into emergency and these productive safety net. And it was a huge, momentum in Ethiopia, having USAID, even if USAID doesn't go through government, having USAID bringing new money to invest in agricultural development. So in conclusion, I think what I wanted to say is that these food aid-based development are great, but they're not enough. And we really need to invest in potential areas. The second issue now is in such a geographical based approach with degraded area and still potential areas, how does a government deal with that? Because a government cannot have geographical divide approach. I mean, an extension services cannot be different if he sits in a woreda, which is degraded, and which is sits. So, and the enabling environment has to tackle both. So that's the next challenge that I believe Ethiopia will face. Thank you very much.
Florence, thank you very much for giving us the field perspective. Again, it seems to me that and some of the other things we have heard simply, can I take that away? Thank you. Really reinforced the need to think about the food security aspect of food aid and the other development resources and how we in fact achieve the goal of food security. And one of the ways, of course, is through the Farm Bill and other legislation. However, let me be quiet because sometimes I talk too much. So now we have lots of time for questions and from answers and comments. So let me open it up. First of all, do any of the panel members have questions for other panel members? Okay. All right, no one said anything. And I will move out here. Okay, I'll ask each person. We don't have mics, do we? That's okay. This is not a large room, and I'm sure everyone can speak loudly. So if you identify, give your name and your organization, okay?
I'll start off with ACDI Loca. First, a couple of quick comments and then a couple of questions. One is just sort of about this GASP acronym. I think those who aren't happy with it should consider the possibility that it could be very beneficial if that's a successful venture. People start referring to it as the Great Gatsby.
Couldn't resist, could you?
Sort of back to front, one comment on the overlap of Title II to Feed the Future, the Mozambique model, if you will. I just would be interested in some reassurance that in Feed the Future, the intent is not to eventually have us only dealing with some 22 countries when Title II non-emergency is of course reaching dozens of very desperately needy countries. The questions, and they're somewhat related. I'm sure Mary will remember decades back, I found myself in the position of representing in FAO the U.S. position that was very anti-repositioning. And the argument, which I thought Mary was very articulate with, was that it was not cost effective, it had problems managerially, that we had so much rain on the high seas that anytime conversion was a better option. What's changed over the decades that we now find repositioning a preferable option? And a real quick one on LRP. Has any thought been given to using LRP for non-emergency purposes as well? We in our programs, I'm sure other PBOs have seen opportunities where it really would have been very helpful in that context, but it wasn't available.
I think, since you actually did 3 questions, let's go ahead and do those and then we'll think. And interesting, I vaguely remember talking about being opposed to prepositioning because we were diverting ships. Of course, that's also when I think the U.S. government had a better ability to divert ships quickly, and we didn't have quite the array of demands in sub-Saharan Africa, or we weren't responding to them. I don't know which is the reality. Whereas back then we were doing a lot more in Central America, and then of course in Asia. But that's as much as I can remember. Your memory's better than mine, Buzz. I mean, I've articulated a lot of U.S. government positions in a lot of places over the years. Okay, some of which I just as soon forget. But anyway, that was my job, and that's what I did. Susan, let's ask you to respond to the Feed the Future question, okay? I think you can use the mics on the table, right? Yes. Okay, thank you.
And I don't know, you said this was yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Did you want us to repeat questions? Can people in your, yeah, all right. I am now responding to a question that was asked by ACDI Avoca Buzz. The question was basically, is it in the thinking of Feed the Future that Title II non-emergency resources will be directed specifically or only to Feed the Future focus countries? And I think that this is not currently at all part of the discussion. I think that there's a real understanding that Title II and Food for Progress programs are targeting populations that Feed the Future would not normally target. Certainly in areas where security is questionable. I mean, even if the agricultural potential in DRC is very, very high, it would not meet the criteria that were applied for the first 20 countries in Feed the Future. That does not mean that Title II and Food for Progress aren't very valuable tools to help not achieve food security. I won't say that in DRC because it's going to take more than Title II and food assistance. But certainly you are contributing to food security objectives in these countries. So no, that is not the intent. Could I say one word about the LRP question?
Of course you may.
Thank you.
You want to say what the LRP question is?
I will. There was a question also about the use of local and regional procurement in non-emergency kinds of situations. And I will say that both, as part of the pilot, I think that USDA is carrying out, and in our support of the World Food Program Purchase for Progress program, there have been resources provided for development procurement processes. However, and John could maybe jump in, certainly one of the arguments that was made that in fact helped us get resources for the emergency food security program was the idea that it's in emergency situations, cash can actually save lives and do it faster than we could do it with food assistance. It's as an emergency response kind of tool. That's how we asked for it, and that is how it's been used up to now.
And just to pick up on that stuff.
Also, John, okay, now we'll go through LRP and then we'll come back to the prepositioning. And I was also curious, how do you define emergencies for purposes? I know it must relate to the fact of how you get the money. Okay. But anyway, if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Under the Mercier Food Security Program, the LRP component, just like the food voucher component and the cash transfer component, can only be used to respond to emergencies, and that is a part of the funding stream. The money is coming from the International Disaster Assistance Account, which can only be used in emergency purposes. What Susan said earlier, specific to USDA, is correct. Their program, which is ongoing, which I think is about $60 million, it's a 5-year program, can be used, and I think has been used predominantly for development.
And so that is something I even may want to follow up with Jamie Fisher and that U.S. Department of Agriculture about. In terms of the definition of an emergency itself, when you look at the solicitation guidance we have in the annual program statement, we define an emergency as a specific shock that has an impact on food security. And that specific shock can be a natural disaster, it could be a man-made disaster, it could be a complex emergency. So there are a host of things that would fall under that.
Yeah. Let me follow up a little bit on the LRP pilot USDA is operating. They have 22 projects going, and so 22 projects dividing up $55 million, $5 million for the study afterwards. Obviously, they're very small scale. They're intended to aid in the examination, the study of the effectiveness of use of LRP under various circumstances. And some of those are development situations as mandated by the statute. But obviously, if we're going to look at this in a larger scale than what's possible in the pilot program, that would require both, I think, additional authority and additional funding. But I think we need to take a look at what happens with the pilot before we make any of those decisions.
Can I say one other thing, Mary?
Yes, and then I'm going to come to Tim, and I think, and then we have GAO wanting to jump in. This is what we want. The pilot is actually, the pilot report is due to Congress in 2012, right? Okay, all right, John, and then Tim.
Just very briefly, the fact that it is emergency assistance doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily have a developmental impact. And so, for example, in Mozambique, we are providing cash assistance for local procurement. The commodities are actually being purchased from farmers who are participating in WFP's P4P program, which is a developmental program.
I haven't forgotten the third question, but I think Tim wants to say something.
Real quickly on the LRP question again, I mean, it's probably my lack of imagination, but it seems there could be some situations where for developmental purposes you'd want to use it, but it seems like in general it would be much more efficient to identify what's the market failure. I mean, you're getting some development impact perhaps on the supply side by encouraging the production, but if it's not going to be sustainable unless what's the market failure that's preventing those farmers being able to sell their produce just in the market. So I think that would be where I'd want to focus in terms of a developmental impact.
Okay, before I leave the LRP, let me see. Is that what you wanted to talk about? I'm pointing to GAO.
No.
Okay, something else. Is yours LRP? Okay, wait a minute then. Let's come back to, because I'll come off back to you in the back. John, do you want to add anything about why prepositioning is good now and it wasn't good way back when?
That is a beautiful question, and I don't know. I mean, I don't remember way back when. I mean, back when I was I don't remember way back when as it relates to this specific question. Back when I was at the U.S. Mission in Rome, and we had prepositioning as a tool, it was certainly warmly embraced by other donors around the table, it was embraced by other governments, and WP as a good thing, and that's why we're grateful that we had this opportunity to expand it.
I see at least two people who seem to want to comment on prepositioning. Am I right? Okay, I'll come over here. Identify yourself very briefly, Paul, and then we will go to the others, okay?
I'm Scott Legend with Director of the World Institute, working for FAS as it was. And Mary, years ago, there was a major factor in the market, and that was commodity credit corporation stocks and commercial stocks, which by and large don't exist. And I think there was a great deal of pressure to move as much of our own product as we could. And I just offer that as one potential change from that.
Okay, I'm not going to comment. Paul, your comment?
I'm Paul Green with the North American Millers Association. I've seen some of these things for as many years as Mary has. The biggest change in prepositioning from my point of view is that the value of prepositioning is not that it is a warehousing program. It is that it is a supply chain management program in which you can purchase in advance of the need. And somewhere in the process is a supply that you hope never gets to a warehouse. Yeah. Because you don't want stuff sitting in a warehouse at 120 degrees and Djibouti. And that's the reason why the original opposition to the whole concept of the FAO got along was that so much stuff went bad.
Now this is all coming back to me. There was the problem with that, and then when we solicited information from the various AID missions, there was great concern about who would fund the necessary security guards. I suggest we leave pre-positioning. Okay, enough on that. It does slowly come back to me. Okay, okay. First, Phil. Phil.
Thank you, Mary.
This is Phil Thomas of GAO.
I want to congratulate Stephanie on a great paper. It's very helpful, retrospectively going back and then going forward, and I appreciate the recognition of GAO's role in the 2008 Farm Bill. As we move forward, we have tried to be very helpful in setting up a framework for the 2012 Farm Bill. We're issuing 3 reports. We issued one on nutrition and food aid quality, on the governing goal, food for education, and coming up will be monetization of food aid. Those 3 reports help deal with some central issues in food aid that the Congress and the executive branch need to address in terms of efficiency and effectiveness as we go forward for the next 4 to 5 years. But I think more importantly, the issue of the dire budget situation the U.S. government is confronting and the need to overcome major proposed cuts in food aid and food security is the #1 challenge. And in our reports, we have concerns over the lack of integration in the field, on the governing goals specifically, and some other areas as well. There is really a need to operationalize the concept of whole of government so that the Congress can perceive it as a step forward. And connected to that is the rhetoric on Feed the Future is wonderful. It's aspirational. There has been some business conducted in Washington. Some would argue USDA is not part of the Feed the Future approach because it just doesn't seem to have leadership role on it. I'll put that aside and then just go to the field and ask the question, how do we produce results in the short term, persuasive enough to give Congress confidence that food aid programs and food security programs should be funded at 100%.
All good comments. So do you have a time schedule when these reports are going to be out? So people have some idea?
2 are out already.
2 are out, I know.
The report was issued May 12th and is available online.
Right.
That's nutrition and food aid quality. The McGovern Dole report was issued May 19th, and our aspiration is to have the monetization report issued June 23rd.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, gentlemen over here. This is very good.
I'm Patrick Johnson from Booz Allen Hamilton's Diplomacy Development Practice, and I think this is a follow-on to your question. It's great to have somebody from GAO and maybe people when you have an audience like this and all of the comments are really interesting, nobody's debating the merits of food security. I mean, this group seems to get the importance. And so my question is more generally, when you're working on the Farm Bill reauthorization, how are you addressing some of the messaging concerns to audiences who might not be as receptive? I believe it was GAO, it might have been OMB, who recently released a report looking at the economic impact of crisis response versus crisis prevention, and found a force multiplier of like 10 to 1. So if we're investing money on the outset and preventing the conflict from taking place, we're saving a lot of money in our response. And I think food security is one of those hot-button issues that ends up leading to a lot of crises globally. And so I'm just wondering, in your dealings with Congress, how do you communicate some of these issues? And I think the GAO reports are a nice tie-in.
This question relates to how the people in this room, I think it's safe to say, are all very supportive of food security, including the food aid contribution to food security. The question from the representative from Booz Allen is, how do we take the necessary information and messaging, favorite word nowadays, and messaging to people who probably, first of all, don't understand the whole subject matter and therefore are not very supportive. So let me ask the members of the panel if they have any thoughts on this. And then also it occurs to me there might be some people in the audience that have a thought on that too.
Well, let me just start by, the Hill staff are very bright, but there's a lot of turnover. And so you need to be conscious of the fact, for example, I worked on the trade title of the 08 Farm Bill. There were 5 principal staffers from House and Senate Ag Committee and House Foreign Relations who were leads for that. There's only 1 of those 5 still on the Hill. So the folks who have an interest in working on this need to sit down with the new staff working on these issues and just get them up to speed. And that is a very basic step. And then once you have, and it's their role that will be the most important, but you also need to have a reasonable level of knowledge among other staff on those committees as well.
Go for it.
I think, Phil, what I was hearing from you, I heard a couple of things. Some I'm going to ignore politely. No. Yeah, you have to have rhetoric in an initiative. That is there. And as I said, the challenges of doing this integration process at a country level it is a challenge. And we have some countries where it's working better than others right now. And some countries that pose even a greater challenge simply because you have very, very black and white differences about where your vulnerability is and where the chances of productivity really are. Just huge differences. And so then you begin to have to ask yourself, okay, what does integration look like at that point? It doesn't mean you bring your food assistance programs down to the productivity areas. It means you've got to open your vision and put together a different kind of vision for that country and for that strategy. It's happening, but it is happening, it's an evolving process right now. But what I was hearing you say is that it would probably be wise, as we continue to come to the Hill to talk, that it's not necessarily Food for Peace that goes up one day and then it's Feed the Future that goes up the next day, because there really is a recognition both on the part of DCHA and BFS that we need each other. The food security equation is both. And there again, I think there's recognition of it. I'm not sure that we're as effectively managing to march in lockstep. The same would go for USDA. I do believe actually that there have been huge strides in collaboration, coordination between USDA and USAID, and not just in Washington. But certainly, if you look at the fact that food assistance hasn't played a prominent part in Feed the Future, that is the same in terms of 416. Mary, I'm way back.
Our way back.
Food for Progress, Title II. But the coordination around research and development, around standards, I mean, it really is coming together between our two agencies. On the Hill, we should be doing the same thing. It should be USDA, USAID, it should be Food for Peace with Food for Progress. And I hear the message, and I'll bring it back. I hear it.
And in the years past, there were times when USDA staff and USAID staff did go to the Hill together. It was sort of just what we did once upon a time, but that sort of disappeared over the years. I'd also suggest that the incentives that both USAID and USDA create for their staff overseas are going to be key to actually getting this joint integrated effort underway. Florence wanted to come to.
Yeah, I think there is a role on these, in the field, on the linkages between these food aid and development. There is a role on donor coordination, because USAID alone, I mean, even if it's a big donor, it's a small fish. So I think in some countries, and in Ethiopia, there is a huge and strong donor coordination body. And this is where the linkages between emergency food aid and development will take place. And even if it doesn't take place in USAID, USDA, it will have to take place. And I believe US and USAID may have an interest in funding this donor coordination body because they can be quite influential and powerful.
Any comments from the audience as to how we do messaging before I go to questions?
I'm Nancy Morgan. I'm FAO's liaison to the World Bank, and this relates to the Bowles Allen issue. I think FAO and the World Bank, we've all been remiss, everybody, in terms of development communication. We come out with great publications and we send them out, and then somehow the messages aren't distilled. And recently, FAO and the World Bank, we worked with the National Resources Institute on missing food. It's a case of post-harvest losses in Africa. And it was really interesting, some of the message that 2 out of 10 kilos of grain go missing between after production to the market. And for example, in Africa, 30% of the population is undernourished, 300 million people. At the same time, they're losing 20% of their grain. The value of the grain is $4 billion. Now, what's $4 billion? $4 billion is enough to feed 48 million people at 2,500 kilos a day. It equates to the value of food aid over the last decade of $6.1 billion in cereals to Africa. Average imports of grains right now, the Food Outlook just came out yesterday. They're looking at for Africa, $35 million in food imports this year, of which probably $11 billion are cereals. And we put together a video, and the World Bank did another video at a recent meeting on what was it was a great animated video.
On food price increase.
The food price increase. So we did this for the food, this issue on missing food. It was really well received. A simple animated video. We put it on YouTube, 3 minutes, and it cost $7,000 or something like that. We just had a regional workshop in Africa and Ghana, and the messaging was incredible. Just simple messaging. It was a 3-minute video. So I think that where everybody is missing is we're all convinced about our areas of expertise on food aid, development assistance, but we don't get out the messaging. And now I think there's this huge area of development communication that we need to exploit, especially in the Farm Bill and educating people on the importance of development. But you have to get, the question is, what are the key messages that resonate with your audience? So I think that's where you need to get these messages and present simply in the public. Have, instead of having discussions on the, start with a 3-minute video. It takes people aback and really resonates.
It is fascinating to hear that FAO and the World Bank are now using the YouTube, whatever it is, YouTube, to put out the communication and educate. You're right, the world has changed in terms of how you can communicate, and we all need to think about it. Okay, I think we need to go. There was a person back here who had a question. Whoops. Okay, all the way in the back. A little louder.
Yes, Oxfam has worked on food aid reform for a number of years and look forward to working on it in the future. I have one observation that if you'd like to respond to, I welcome it. And one quick question. The observation is around the pilot study for local and regional purchase that was included as part of USDA's work last Farm Bill. ESSP is up and running. Various donors are employing local and regional purchase for food aid. The question is, what was the intent of a study that would only look at a $60 million program? Is the intent to inform and educate committee members on this program? And in that context, looking only at a $60 million program and not taking a wider perspective on other programs that the U.S. is operating or funding seems to be a bit myopic in terms of getting a full range of experience to draw lessons, best practices from. The question is on the recent study of nutritional quality of food aid. Lots of good recommendations that come forward, both for the GAO's report as well as the tough study. Much of this work can be taken on, I think, administratively. Question for you is whether or not there are legislative issues that need to be addressed as part of the recommendations or the implementation of the recommendations in order to achieve the improvements in food quality.
There are 2 questions from the Oxfam representative. The first one I'm going to ask, maybe both of them. But first of all, Stephanie, you raised a question about sort of why have the USDA pilot study at $60 million over 4 years at the same time that we had another large ongoing program. So what was the motivation in thinking of putting that in the Farm Bill?
Well, first of all, you need to take a look at the timing. And the Farm Bill was actually completed in May and June of '08, which was before the additional resources became available through the Foreign Ops Committee. So we didn't know that there was going to be that level of interest in other committees. And so the intention was to sort of get a foothold. My view was that there was very strong opposition to LRP in the ag community for a lot of reasons. And then the aim of the LRP pilot was to demonstrate that, in fact, on a rigorous basis, there are situations where use of cash is more effective and efficient than in kind, but there are probably situations where it's not, and the pilot is intended to lay that out. I'm certainly pleased that the FSP is available now and has resources to LRP, but I don't think that necessarily renders what the pilot is doing unusable. I still think it's going to be useful information.
Certainly, since the pilot can focus on the development aspect, not just the emergency, which is all that the other foreign ops account can do, I think would be useful. Okay. The second question was, we had quite a bit of work on the improving the nutritional impact of the commodities used in U.S. food aid. Both the Tufts University has put out a study and GAO has put out a study. The gentleman noted quite correctly, I think, that much of it can be done administratively by the executive branch, but he raised the question, is there anything that's needed legislatively? I have to feel that Phil from GAO wanted to comment on that.
Well,
Stephanie.
I just wanted to add something to this question. That is, when we did the GAO did the 2007 report on the efficiency and effectiveness of food aid, we identified this food aid quality and nutrition issue. They're separate in some ways, in many ways. But we urged that studies be taken immediately. It is now 2011. USDA has a sustained study, consultant study. USAID has the tough study. 4 years have lapsed. Nutrition, as Susan said, is a critical element of Feed the Future. And most NGOs will tell you U.S. food aid needs to be enhanced from a nutritional perspective. The key issue, obviously, here is cost. But the big point here is, when will the government act? You know, we've had studies, we've had discussion. Is there a time frame to make significant changes in the nutritional aspect of food aid as well as the quality?
Yeah, I'm going to come to Stephanie on the legislative question, and then come to John and Susan on the timing of when things need to be undertaken. And I realize that neither of you all may be really aware. Okay, I'll handle that one.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is there is no additional legislative authority needed to undertake the kinds of changes that, for example, the Tufts study recommends. All of that would be within the purview of AID and USDA, I think. It's just a matter of doing it.
I had a very small role with the Tufts group, and that was my conclusion as I read the report and listened to the conversations, that in fact we don't need legislation to do that. Okay, I think Susan wants to comment.
I just want to say, Phil, I hear you. 4 years, I'm not even going to apologize for that. But what I do know is that, and I think you saw, the administrator was really struck by the study. I think one of the wonderful things about the study was it caught his attention and he is focused on it. So that makes me hope that that's going to translate into sort of a very specific expectation that we act. And I don't know, John, if you want to add anything, but I know that it's a priority of Dina, the new Food for Peace director, and John Browse, who's been doing this forever. So I'm hopeful that we're going to move quickly.
Just to say that it most definitely is a part of the study.
Certainly a good time for the office. I don't know whether, is Dale Skorick here by chance, probably in the back room? Dale is the head of our policy and technical division and is the point person on that report. But just to say, it is certainly a priority. I don't know any more. I'm certainly interested in the timeline impact
You know, and one thing I would add is that it will be very helpful to have Ross Shaw interested and engaged in this, because when you have a push from the top, you're more likely to get real action than if it's coming from below.
I was going to say, having been a bureaucrat too many years, let me tell you, it is just crucial to have the person at the top, I was going to use the word, care about what happens. You just can't imagine what a difference it makes. Partly because there are always so many demands on people who manage all of these programs. Demands from the executive branch, demands from Congress, demands from all of you out here in the audience, and sometimes you forget how much it is. This gentleman over here was having a question.
Yes, John Coonrod with the Hunger Project, and I want to ask a little more of Stephanie about Kim's question, the more fundamental question of whether it makes any sense at all to have food, non-emergency food aid. I was always told it makes sense only because it was politically expedient resources, and that the politics have now changed in terms of the pressures to move commercial stocks. So I'm just wondering, has the politics changed, and is there an actual argument for non-emergency?
Okay, this question raises what I think is really a fundamental question that we're going to be addressing because of the budget, which is with the budget constraints and the changed world, what in fact is the continuing role of non-emergency food aid? It's a whole different world than when we have a lot of money and you could get it. So we'll start with Stephanie, and then Kim also wants to say something.
Yeah, I agree the politics have changed. I'm not sure they changed that much, especially since we're talking about the Agriculture Committee. And there's a set of stakeholders there that has a very strong interest in maintaining the way the Title II is run right now. And to contemplate a step as radical as not doing any non-emergency development out in Title II, that's a huge step. And it is not one that's going to be driven by the budget process, I don't think. I mean, because the money, you know, Title II will still be there. There'll still be funding for it, whether it's $1 billion or $1.5 billion or $2 billion. And there's still going to be people on both ends trying to make sure that some of those resources are kept in non-emergency development. We're not there yet.
Okay, Kim.
Maybe this is bouncing it back to Stephanie, but whether, I mean, if we did go down a path of sort of phasing out the development part of Title II, non-emergency, and moving it more into other USAID development programs, would it be helpful then, or maybe Susan or John would also want to comment, to actually have authorizing legislation for Feed the Future that would kind of lock it in?
Yeah.
I now will go to Susan on the Feed the Future authorization question.
Yeah. And maybe not the Feed the Future.
Maybe not the question, or maybe
but
not Susan.
I was waiting for Blake or somebody back there to say, yeah, what about those community development funds? One of the things that we requested in the FY11 authorization was this money, community development funds, that would offset the Title II safe box. And this was not, the idea behind it wasn't to do away with development or non-emergency food assistance. It was to reduce our reliance on monetization to fund development. So the idea was to make a resource available to organizations engaged in the kind of community-based, grassroots kind of development with very vulnerable populations, but to give them an alternative to monetization to do that kind of work. Yeah, and I think that as we move forward, that would be a very interesting way to continue the dialogue, because it is 80 cents, you know, for every dollar then that in food assistance that you're monetizing. So I think it's two things. I think it's that we need a tool. We need to use development funds to fund development in many situations, most situations. And we do need to be very cognizant of the fact that food is a very valuable resource now as we move forward, an incredibly valuable resource.
With the nutrition problems and the high cost of Stephanie, did you want to say anything?
Well, when the community development idea was first floated in 2010, it occurred not within the Farm Bill cycle. So the procedure generally is that if you want to get something that would be a standalone piece that isn't part of the Farm Bill, you need everybody to agree to it. It really has to, because of the demands for time on the Senate floor for other issues, you really need essentially unanimous consent in the Senate to move a piece like that, and there just wasn't that level of support. And AID came up and proposed it, and was sort of lukewarm reception, and then it died. I mean, no one ever pushed it. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but the timing was not good for it, and my paper does recommend that we take a second look at it, but it's going to take a push. It's not something that's just going to magically drop from the sky and be in the next Farm Bill. It's going to take some effort.
Can we come back to Susan, and then I know the gentleman back there.
Just one more quick word. We did receive funds, and I don't even have the final number, for community development funds in the FY11 allocation. But what we didn't receive was the language. We would need legislative language for it to fulfill the purpose that at least OMB supported this the request, and that the purpose is that it actually offset the safe box, the Title II safe box.
I think you've identified what may be something that pushes reconsideration. Less budget, safe box in the Farm Bill, and I can only imagine how difficult it must be over at USAID's Office of Food for Peace as to how they try to manage those things. So we will see if that generates any interest and attention to come back to the Community Development Fund. I'm going to go to the gentleman back there and then this gentleman here, and by then I think we'll be out of time.
Hi, Steve Meyer from State Control. Susan, I wanted to follow up on this idea around the CDF and monetization, because I'm very curious to know, knowing that Mozambique is one of those places where monetization is used extensively, is part of the motivation for that transition that you described to, in fact, phase out monetization in Mozambique?
Specific question? Specific answers? Oh, the question is, in Mozambique, which has been discussed here as an example of the Title II Feed the Future relationship, monetization has been a significant activity in Mozambique for a number of years. And the question was, do you see that phasing out, or how do you see that playing out?
No, my understanding, I haven't been in Food for Peace now for several years, but my understanding just from engagement with this program was that it was the intention to phase Title II out of Mozambique anyway. And what the mission did, and very intelligently did, is they developed their Feed the Future plan as a phase-out plan. So the Title II program is is graduating its beneficiaries directly into Feed the Future activities. If the question, it is absolutely true that the administrator does want us to try to reduce monetization when that process isn't having a developmental impact. He's not out to just, but he does question why we would be doing monetization when it is not contributing to a development objective within the country.
Okay, gentleman here.
Hey, my name is Brian Gardner. I'm a maritime lawyer, Winston and Strong, and I wanted to make 3 points on private preference that were mentioned in the paper, in Stephanie's paper. And first, Stephanie, thanks so much for everything you did during the Farm Bill, especially the story about pre-positioning and making it, the whole program works better is great, and that's a great success story. On the waiver process, it's my understanding that there is a waiver of private preference available through the Maritime Administration, through the inside Department of Transportation, under law. Two, on the reimbursement, the paper says that reimbursement is available to the extent that there's an ocean price differential, U.S. flight market, like over 50%. But there's also a much larger component, the excess ocean freight differential, which is the extent by which transportation exceeds 20% of the volume of transportation and commodities. And that actually winds up allowing the total reimbursement. In fact, recently there was an over reimbursement of the program. So there's a net transfer back to the program, according to the U.S. Maritime Administration data. And that's not, I'm not making that up.
it's been said that it's just taking money out of one department and putting it in another. And the reason that it's done is because it allows the Department of Defense to rely on these ships, these commercial ships, because if it had to go out on its own and buy its own fleet and operate it every year and build transportation infrastructure, it would cost, DOD has said it would cost a great deal of money. So those are my 3 points.
We are about to run out of time, so I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair and respond. We've just had several interesting, useful comments about the cargo preference requirement and the provisions in the Farm Bill that relate to that, including noting that the Maritime Administration does have waiver authority in terms of the cost of ships. However, having dealt with that subject once upon a time in another life, I can only say it is extremely, extremely difficult to, for the agencies involved, the operating ones, which are USDA and USAID, to sufficiently explain the cost implications to get Merritt to undertake the waiver. However, I appreciate your points about the transfer of money. I would also note that for a while it was very expensive to figure out the transfer. But nonetheless, this is a subject we will come back to. Chris Barrett, there are a number of papers that have been done on the cargo preference. Chris Barrett up at Cornell University did one several months ago, time flies when you're having fun, which talks about that. And then I understand, and I don't remember the name of the organization, the paper from Cornell sort of outlined the high cost and some of the operational concerns about cargo preference. And then there was a paper from, sorry, I don't remember the organization.
USA Maritime. It's available at USA Maritime.
Okay, USA Maritime that sort of made some different arguments. So if you're interested, Google cargo preference. My guess is you can find all sorts of things. First of all, I want to thank Stephanie and our panel for a really great job. And I want to thank all of you who came and listened. This is going to be a subject that's going to be going on for a while. It is one we need to continue to pay attention to, and we need to, I think, expand the dialogue and conversation beyond the traditional community. I think that was a very good point about messaging and using modern technology. And we need to educate all those new staffers on the Hill, because Stephanie is right. They turn over all the time, and they'll turn over again in a few months. Anyway, thank you all very much. I was going to bring up the subject of population with the sales, but I think nobody wants to talk about that population.